Great. Looks like we have nearly 60 participants, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Using Seafood Supply Chain Data to Identify Human Rights Risks webinar. My name is Jenny Barker, and I'm the Chief of Party for SALT, which is the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. Today, we'll give you a brief introduction of SALT, and then we'll share the important work that we commissioned in support of social responsibility in fishery supply chains with our guests, Judy Gearhart and Rainer Braun. As I noted, please go ahead and put your name and organizational affiliation in the chat box. Before we get started, we are going to do this in a meeting format, which means we'll be able to see faces at the end of this to have a bit of a dialogue, because we really do want to hear from participants. We had more than 120 RSVPs, and so if you have any colleagues that somehow are not able to join, know that this will be recorded, and we'll share the recording with you after the end of the meeting. The meeting is 90 minutes, so we'll leave 1 hour around, we'll do 1 hour of presentations, and then we'll do 30 minutes for questions and interactions. I'm joined by two colleagues on SALT who have supported this work and who can answer also a lot of your questions, with Sarah Lewis and Brent O'Donnell. Throughout the presentations, we're going to go ahead and do all of the presentations back to back, and then we'll save the questions for the end. But we do want you to submit your questions via chat as we go, and as you think of them and as you have them. We will monitor them, we'll answer them if we can, or ask them live at the end of the session. And so just place your question in the chat. You can indicate if you would like to ask it live, in which case we can unmute you at the end, or we'll ask it on your behalf. So let's get started. First off, just quickly about SALT, I want to offer some framing to the piece of work that we've done with Judy and Rainer. As many of you know, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing represents one of the most complex issues confronting the world today, and addressing IUU fishing and the associated human and labor rights abuses can affect millions of people who depend on fisheries for their livelihoods. And so as a result, USAID partnered with the Walton Family Foundation, the Packard Foundation, and the Moore Foundation on this alliance to tackle these issues. SALT is implemented by Fishwise, which is a nonprofit sustainable seafood consultancy. And SALT was really conceived of as a collaboration and learning project focused on bringing together seafood industry, governments, and non-governmental organizations and others to think about innovative solutions to ensure legal and sustainable seafood. And our focus is really on traceability. You can see our 4 objectives here, but this piece of work falls really squarely within that objective number 4, which is around supporting human and labor rights for all seafood workers, food security, their livelihoods, and well-being overall. So at the end of SALT, which is a 5-year project, we envision a global community with increased engagement and information that contributes to more comprehensive electronic catch documentation and traceability systems and programs globally. And it's really important here to note that comprehensive term. For us, a comprehensive project should capture ecological, social, and economic data related to seafood products in order to support and strengthen effective fisheries management, identify and prevent IUU and mislabeled products from entering markets, and the topic of today, supporting legal and equitable human welfare conditions for seafood laborers. A key deliverable for SALT has been the launch of the comprehensive electronic catch documentation and traceability principles and the associated pathway to apply them in order to help with this larger transition to more electronic traceability globally. These are the 6 principles that act as sort of the guiding lights for what you want to consider when you're doing an electronic traceability program. The principles are not meant to be phased, they're not linear or in any priority order, they are all kind of equally important. I do want to call your attention just to 2 really important principles that are relevant for today's conversation. The first one is be inclusive and collaborative with stakeholders. So the guidance here covers a lot of important topics related to how it is you should identify and offer meaningful collaboration with stakeholders across government, all the way to fishers. But it also calls out the importance of considering power dynamics in those relationships among stakeholders in the consultative process. So from workers to businesses, men and women, government and private sector, and how we can be really sensitive to those needs as part of development of a comprehensive program. The second one is the maximizing ecological, social, and economic benefits. And this principle really covers the importance of using and identifying ways to use data in order to support some of the social responsibility goals for seafood supply chains. But when we were developing these with nearly 20 stakeholders from nearly 20 countries around the world, we noticed there really was the least information around the potential to maximize those social benefits and identify social risks. And so that's why we were excited to partner with Judy and Rainer on this work. We needed to hear from the experts about what's possible now for traceability to support social goals, and then also where we need to go into the future. Just a quick note, we also have a pathway to support the principles, and it makes the principles really actionable by laying out steps to applying them when trying to implement a comprehensive program. It's broken down into initiate, designate, and implement. And it's really a great way to understand better how to apply them. So I can just encourage you to check out the SALT website and the principles so you can understand that tool. But now to the really meat of today, if you will, and the important thing that we're here to discuss. You're here to learn really from two experts in the human rights and labor rights space, and to identify what information we have in supply chains to identify social risks now as a starting point to tackle important human rights issues, but also thinking about what future opportunities can be unlocked using traceability systems to support workers globally. So Judy Gearhart works with the American University's Accountability Research Center, and she also is an adjunct at Columbia University. She is the former director of ILRF, which is the International Labor Rights Forum. And Rainer Braun is an expert in human rights and governance, and he is a professor at Columbia University. So welcome, everyone. Thank you to Judy and Rainer for your support on this project. And now over to you.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Jenny. You are out of your screen share, right? Can you see mine?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Jenny, for that kind introduction. As she said, my name is Rainer Braun. I will be conducting the first half of this webinar. Then Judy will do the second part of this. On the outset, we are, well, let me just show you basically the structure of what we're going to talk about. We will give you an indication of our approach. We want to give you a high-level summary of what we think really are the takeaway points from the relationship between ECDT and human rights. And then we'll talk about human rights in supply chains. We will talk about how they relate to the principles of the ECDT systems that SALT has come up with. Then the second big part is going to be talking about key data elements, the kind of data that is being collected and how they relate to the idea of doing something about human rights. And I put it in this sort of nebulous phrase on purpose, and I'll tell you in a little bit why in a minute. And then we'll talk about enforcement and implementation, and how different elements of human rights come into play for that. And then, of course, there will be a conclusion. I forgot to enter that into the agenda. Judy will come in at about half of the presentation. She'll do the second half. I'll do the first. And then, as Jenny mentioned, questions will be collected through the chat or through other forms of intervention, I think directed at Bryn, who gladly will deal with all of that. And then we'll hopefully have a good amount of time to discuss what we are doing here. The research goal for our project, our contribution to thinking about ECDT, is to think about the potential linkages between what ECDT does, what ECDT could do, and what human rights monitoring is. In this work, Judy and I come from a dedicated human rights perspective. And human rights is one of those terms that a lot of people use without necessarily operationalizing it. Human rights are distinct. Human rights, and this will be the biggest part of my talk, human rights are not just some other concept of goodness or goodwill. But there's certain expectations that we have, certain criteria that we need to meet in order to have a human rights conversation. The policy objective, at least the way Judy and I understand it, of what ECDT, not our research, but what the policy intervention or the creation of ECDT systems bring, is to get the right data to the right people to create change. We're very much motivated from the position that data by itself is not the desirable part, but data used, employed, implemented, however you want to phrase it, in order to create change for the improvement of human rights is what drives our thinking through this project. And this is different from how other people approach ECDT. I just want to make clear that we're transparent about where we're coming from. The methodological approach is that we were asked to do expert interviews, people who have expertise in fisheries, either that be from the labor conditions on both sides, whether it is from the governance side, whether it is from the human rights overall side. So we talked to several experts from governments, from NGOs, from trade unions, journalism, in order to get their views on what that relationship is. And then, of course, we bring our perspective in addition to that. And I'm distinguishing these two on purpose because I'm not an expert in fisheries, and I don't want to present myself as one. I have not been out on the boats in the high seas. I've seen movies. I've talked to a lot of people. I think I have a sense of what's going on, and it's scary stuff at times. But I'm coming from an expertise with the role of human rights in corporate social accountability, or CSR, corporate social responsibility. The idea of bringing this new norm set, the only really existing norm set on a global level that everybody agrees to, at least by at least lip service, and how to make it work on the ground with people who do work. And then, of course, we did according desk research. We're started in all of this by a couple of premises. And when I keep saying we, I'm always referring to Judy and me. We work on this together. We, of course, agreed on everything that we're saying here. We do sometimes have slight difference of interpretation, but I'm not using a royal we. I'm using this as a team we, obviously. The first premise is that in order to do anything meaningful about human rights through ECDT, we need multi-stakeholder cooperation. No single agent by themselves will be in a position to push us where we need to be in order to govern the high seas, to improve labor conditions on the boats. The role that different stakeholders take, the weighing of their responsibilities needs to be played out in contextualized disaggregation. So it might play out differently in one fishery from the other, but no single agent, no single government by itself, no buyer, no corporation by itself will be able to make that key difference. We're also working from the premise that there is a well-established correlation between IUU fishing and forced labor. And you see the little circle to the side, the little symbol, and point 3, the chicken and egg question, whether it is because of overfishing that labor gets exploited more, or because labor is being exploited that we're overfishing. There is no clear single causality in these kind of issues, and that is usually the case for most human rights discussions. It's a complex challenge that involves so many different elements. And that's why Judy and I were really happy to hear Salt stressing again and again that this is a comprehensive approach. The idea is really to attack it, to think through it, to include points of view from many different angles in order to do something about this. Which leads me to the last premise, which is that labor rights violations, and this is actually true for all human rights violations, can really not be solved in isolation. They're not puzzle exercises where we can have a single intervention, usually, to just fix a system. Human rights violations are usually the result of a complex interplay of all kinds of things. I know that's a very untechnical language, but basically what they come down to is power imbalances. At least that's the point of view that Judy and I take on this work in general, not just on ECDT, but on all corporate social responsibility work. In summary, we do find that ECDT systems set up properly have potential, important potential to support human rights at sea. The first is to link the social risk KDEs that are being collected and those that might get collected, and we'll get to that in the second part of the presentation, to enforcement. As I said earlier, any form of data collection without enforcement from a human rights perspective is empty. We need to have action following the data, but we need data in order to have some action. And what we see in the context of very reduced government resources and very limited commitment, more data on identifying where those limited resources are spent best is really helpful. The second part, and I think this is something that is clearly outside of the original ECDT mandate, but Judy and I will keep bringing it in till the end of time, is that the way that ECDT has an additional potential, and that is in fostering collaboration. What we mean by that is the data collection needs a sort of governance system that makes it happen. You need somebody to collect data, to store data, to talk about what the data is, to decide who gets to use it, to get to use it for what purposes. All of that is a governance question. That governance over how these systems are set up has the potential to include those stakeholders that we find are most important in the inclusion in order to do something about human rights. And that is actually a fostering of a human rights atmosphere or an ecosystem that goes beyond what goes on a boat. The idea is to include social partners into decision-making with governments and ideally transnational corporations or buyer states in order to give them legitimacy. This is one of the major political long-term goals of all forms of democratization and pretty much all forms of human rights advocacy, to give people a seat at the table to be heard. And we see that as a potential. It's not a given, but all this work is based on potentials. We also want to make clear that ECDT, and this is the limitation in point 2, is not any ECDT system, even the most perfect system with great satellites and anonymity and blockchain and whatever you may have, and you can tell I'm not an expert in that, will not protect workers. It is a contributing element with potential to do so, but not by itself the tool that is needed. The tool needed to get workers' rights protections is still some form of intervention, some form of regulation that may come from different sources. And what these sources are, again, needs to be contextualized in specific fisheries. It may be a government, it may be a multilateral agency, it may be a buyer, it may be an NGO that is entitled and empowered to do these kind of things. But it is not the data itself that will accomplish this. The third point that we are gathering from the expert interviews is that the governance of the system is key in order to bring a human rights element to ECDT. As long as you have multi-party participation, but participation with power, participation with input, participation with a bite, so to speak, then you can do something about human rights. And that is a long-term process. We're not saying that that will solve problems on the sea right away. Finally, one of the things that very much everybody agrees on that we talk to is that in order to get the ECDT system set up, maintained, and continued, recreated over and over again with the inclusion of more data relevant for human rights, you will need political and particularly market leverage. If this process is left to port states alone or producer countries alone, there is a limited promise from a human rights perspective that this will be done in a way that we would like to see it done. And when I say we, I'm talking about the social side of the comprehensive. I'm talking about the human rights side, right? The ECDT may make a great contribution on the economic and on the ecological sides, but from our perspective, that will be essential. Which brings me to, what do we mean when we talk about human rights? And this is a bit lectury, so I may want to apologize in advance on this. But pretty much everybody has heard about the term human rights. Everybody agrees that it's a good thing. Nobody wants to be the next Pol Pot or something like that. But there's often a misunderstanding of what it means to work on human rights, to make human rights operationable. And in order to make clear what we expect as human rights advocates, as human rights activists, from any actor doing something of human rights, is the linkage of human rights to their issue area, in this case ECDT, through 4 core concepts: accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and participation. You will have different people in my field, in human rights, disagree over the weighting of these points and even of the importance of the points. And this is something that's been running through the CSR discussion from day one. I've been working on this for 20 years. And when we started looking into the corporate social responsibility for human rights in factories, apparel factories, for example, there was a lot of agreement on non-discrimination. There was some agreement on participation, but when I say agreement, particularly by TNCs, by transnational corporations, but very little agreement about empowerment and what that means. And at first, an outright fighting of accountability. So what do I mean by these terms? Or what do we mean? What do we mean by these terms? Sorry about that. Accountability is one of the explicit core concepts of human rights. It is in the UDHR. It is running through everything that human rights is, which is, whenever an individual has a right, whether that is me, Jenny, or any fisher on a boat, that individual has rights. That's the whole idea of human rights. And that right is only meaningful if somebody else is obligated to do something about it. Somebody needs to be the duty bearer for an individual rights holder. Human rights, and that is their big contribution, basically, in world philosophy or governance or whatever you want to say, is to identify very clearly that it's governments that are responsible for the rights of individuals. It's nation-state governments that are the duty bearer, that are the obligated party to do something about individual rights. And since the UN guiding principles on business human rights, we can now even include corporations, businesses at large, as an obligated party. This is not a choice thing. It is the idea that somebody is responsible for human rights violations. Human rights are originally a state-centric system. It was all focused on the nation state. We've broadened it for businesses. And what that means, what makes it so interesting from an academic perspective to work on what's going on in the high C, is that it's really not clear who's accountable for anything, because the high seas are outside of jurisdictions. But we talk about human rights here. So somebody needs to be accountable. And that's why, of course, we have things like port states, we have flag states, we have owners of the vessel. Somebody is accountable. And if we cannot identify who is accountable, we're not having a human rights discussion. We can have a social conditions discussion, we can have an exploitation discussion. But when we talk about human rights, we talk about accountability. ECDT, and this is our first potential contribution, holds the potential of helping to identify who's accountable for specific violations at sea. In that ECDT is already tracing information about the flag state, the port state, the owners in their registration. So we can trace back through ECDT, even already, who in the end holds some level of accountability for what goes wrong on a boat. That's important. Most human rights work up to this point, I would argue, has been about accountability. And as I would project over the next generations, as we move forward, it will move more into the other 3 fields, particularly into empowerment and participation. But accountability is the starting point. If we can't point to who's accountable, we can't do human rights work. ECDT makes a contribution to this. The second core concept is non-discrimination. And that is probably the one that is clearest to everybody, because if we single out a specific population for their ethnicity or for their gender or their belief system or whatever it is, we are not talking about human rights anymore. We're talking about a human rights violation. Minorities get singled out because they tend to be disempowered. And non-discrimination is another explicit core concept in all human rights, that you must not discriminate on grounds of the identity of a person. This is of direct relevance to the discussion of EZDT and fisheries, since a lot of the workers on vessels are migrants. And it needs to be clear what the power relationship is between those who are from the country, of the same country as the officers are of a vessel, or if they are from a different background. The third core concept, and this is an implicit concept, is the idea of empowerment. And this is where some human rights colleagues of mine would step away and say, we can't talk about this. We talk about this very much so because from the position of labor rights, and we're talking here about labor conditions at sea, human rights violations exist because of power imbalances. And empowerment allows something to do about that. What that means in the context of labor rights and working conditions are defined by the whole setup of the International Labour Organization, which will also feature importantly for the fourth point. What I mean by this is, once we talk about labor rights, we have to talk about how labor rights are defined in international law, how labor rights have been conceived from the very beginning through the International Labour Organization. We have to talk about how labor is a countervailing power to management. The ideas that are at the heart of this are freedom of association and collective bargaining. On boats, this is going to be very hard. This is very removed because it's very hard to organize anybody on a boat, particularly to organize anybody on a jurisdiction that is not clearly regulated. And abusive power relations are common on boats, not even just on fisheries. What ECDT brings to the idea of empowering workers on vessels is the potential to connect to support systems, to networks, or to regulatory agencies on land. It's not an immediate empowerment of the fishers because the power imbalance between officers and workers on boats are stark, but it makes a potential contribution towards the balancing of that power imbalance that creates the abuses. The fourth core concept for human rights, again, an implicit concept, is participation. There are some human rights that are very clearly saying that, for example, you have the right to participate in the politics of your country. So there's an explicit statement of it. But again, when we talk about labor rights, we need to look at the setup of the ILO, which is the definitive authoritative source of everything that is labor rights globally. And the ILO is set up in a tripartite structure. The whole idea is that stakeholders get included into the governance and norm setting that affect their lives. That very core concept of participation is unavoidable, even though it is trying to be avoided many times, particularly by corporations in the talk about how do you deal with codes of conduct or how do you include human rights into your management systems. From a human rights perspective, workers' voices need to be included. They need to have a participatory role, and that participatory role cannot be limited to just being informed of what's going on, but it needs to come from an empowerment perspective. Any work on human rights should at least promote one of those four core concepts. If you work for non-discrimination, even though you might not say anything about empowerment or participation, we can argue that you're making a human rights contribution. However, if you're working on one of those four, or even several, and by working on them violating one of these four core concepts, you've left a human rights discussion. So you cannot, for example, talk about participation in a discriminatory fashion. You cannot say some people can participate and others cannot. All right. The second part, or the second element of what's important to talk about human rights, is how do we actually monitor them? How do we go about them? Now, the work on on the social elements for comprehensive ECDT systems is based on the concept of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries. From a human rights perspective, we can only talk about the second two. We can only talk about the use. We can talk about unreported and unregulated in a meaningful way. We cannot really talk about illegal operations. The reason is that human rights are not a criminal norm. That sounds wrong. It's not a tool of criminal law. Human rights are not there to catch criminals. That's what criminal law does. That's why we talk about human rights and criminal law, for example, international criminal law, as in the ICC. Human rights are based on the idea that you have a legitimate authority in power, such as a government or a corporation, that can do things to improve rights, and that through policies will do so. In other words, if you have an illegal operation, if you have a bunch of criminals, for example, in forced labor or human trafficking, going to them and waving the UDHR in their face is not going to make a difference. We use the UDHR, we use human rights to talk to people with legitimate forms of power to improve their policies. And that's why, from a human rights perspective, the discussion of governance is so important in all of this. We're talking about long-term improvement of systems. We're not talking about spot interventions for individual wrongdoers. That's the regulatory part of it. But on the unreported and unregulated part of IUU fishing, human rights need to come in order so that things do get reported, that they do get regulated. And that's where we see these potentials of ECDT in that work. And I didn't mention that for the fourth principle in the slide before. So we see the potential for ECDT in the participation element, in the inclusion of stakeholders, and particularly of trade unions, also other civil society organizations, but particularly the inclusion of trade unions into the governing structure of the ECDT systems. That allows a level of participation that is meaningful, that channels workers' voices and concerns into the setup of these systems. For the monitoring of human rights, one topic that is very much at the forefront of the discussion of human rights and working conditions of fisheries is the question of forced labor. And that's why we wanted to single it out just for a second to say a couple of things about that. As we mentioned in the premises, we are working on the premise of the interconnectivity of rights. In cases of forced labor, it is not that there's a single cause that can be held responsible for workers being forced to be on a boat to do this kind of work. Forced labor does not exist in a vacuum. So we need to look at comprehensive solutions for this. The key document, I think, that explains it well is the ILO's 2012 report, Hard to See, Harder to Count. And they make very clear that forced labor can be only assessed in a risk context. You cannot really go to a worker and say, are you being forced to work here, for example, on a boat, if you have the captain standing right next to him? Or even if it's an anonymous interview, it's not clear that any worker would even be fully realizing that the work that they're doing is forced because of, for example, debt bondage or something like that. So in order to get a better grasp on what the level of forced labor is on boats, we would need a monitoring approach that is focused on risk indicators rather than the direct indicators of is a worker forced. And those risk indicators, as suggested by the ILO, roughly fall into two parts, which is the idea of involuntariness and penalties, or the menace of penalties. So are you on this boat because you want to be on this boat? And what happens if you speak up, if you disagree, if you want to leave this workplace? When we looked at the work of SALT, we looked, of course, and talked to them about the ECDT principles that are set up in order to make these systems a reality, or a stronger reality. And we found that the connection, the linkages of the ECD principles to the human rights core concepts are very obvious. So the ECDT principles are driven by data informed decisions. Absolutely. And in order for that data to inform decision, you need stakeholders who can look at that data to shape decisions, to basically guide, to channel decisions to happen. The ECDT principle is that of interoperability. That again is a part of participation, of data sharing. It needs to be inclusive. So you cannot be discriminatory. You have to have worker reps engaged, for example, clearly from the tripartite structure and from how labor rights have been defined. But you also need to engage, for example, representatives of migrant workers, people who cannot engage in the formal structure of human rights agency through the nature of their work. It needs to be scalable, which is of course something that from a human rights perspective is very desirable, since human rights cannot be human rights just for a couple of elite boats somewhere that already are fairly high on the standards that they employ in their work. We want human rights operations, we want human rights protections to reach everybody, ideally. You want to maximize synergies from the ECDT perspective, and that of course is the same from a human rights perspective, and that means collaboration on the design of the systems. And you do want to improve verification, which is to say, from our perspective, we need cooperation between the public and the private sector, which from a human rights perspective, with the UN guiding principles, is now not just wishful thinking, it's a demand. It's a call, it's a responsibility that the world at large has identified corporations, businesses have for the promotion of human rights. From all this talk about what human rights is and where we see it connected to the work of ECDT, we talk then, of course, after monitoring, about data. What is the data that is there, where it's coming from? We distinguish in our analysis, mostly from our expert interviews, that we should think about 3 different points of origins for the data for ECDT: port controlled or port generated data, vessel controlled, and worker controlled. These levels make a big difference in that at this point, on the 3rd level, on the worker controlled data, there is pretty much nothing there. But again, there is a promise, there's a potential that through working ECDT systems, workers could get access to those databases, to give input in an anonymous fashion, which is very important, to either from the boat or individually on land. And there are technological ideas and solutions and suggestions. They're just not in place yet. The port controlled ones are the easiest to generate, but they're meaningful for long-term risk assessment. And the vessel controlled ones are the ones that we find are the ones that currently most at stake, where data is generated. And the question is just, how can that data that is being generated be used or connected to interventions? This leads me to my last point for my part of this presentation, which is our call for data sharing, which is connected to the human rights core concept of participation. We need to have some form of cooperation amongst the different normative sources, as well as the implementers, on what are they gathering currently and how and what is available to let them share data with each other. And this is mostly triggered by our experience with data not being shared in low-skill industry supply chains, and particularly apparel throughout the world, where we know of cases where inspectors of a transnational corporation went to factories, assessed that the factory was faulty, was dangerous, said we cannot produce here, but didn't share that information with the government of that country or other corporations who kept sourcing from that very place. And when it collapsed, when it burnt down, when workers got killed, that corporation did its job, did its due diligence, said, we don't want to work here. But lives could have been saved by that information having been shared amongst many stakeholders, which then allow for much more informed interventions if we identify high-risk situations. With that, I'd like to hand the stage over to Judy.
Okay, you can hear me now. Sorry about that. Okay, so this slide brings together a lot of different actors that we're hoping that the setup of the ECDT principles will pull together. And we could have thrown a lot more logos up there, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of the different places where activity is happening. Of course, there are more certifications. Of course, there are more national initiatives than Iceland and the US. And we know the global dialogue on seafood and traceability is an important one, but there are other similar initiatives. When we talk to the human rights and trade union leaders and activists, they were all very open to the idea that ECDT could be additive and could be leveraged, but keywords being additive and leveraged. And we were trying to think about how many more data points could be added. We're very aware, and through our conversations with SALT and some of their advisors, we're very much understanding that the environmental movement is adding social criteria to ECDT is a challenge, and they're already strapped for resources to be able to set up these systems. So we went into these conversations very much saying, how can we use what's already there? And if in the future there could be more, then what? And so we looked at the key data elements that are being put forward by the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. And we also looked at a couple other key sources, primarily the US Seafood Import Monitoring Program that NOAA runs. And then we also looked at the, next slide, Rainer, the International Labor Organization for guidance with their convention on work in fishing. And the work in fishing convention, there's not a lot of data currently being collected that relates to this, but we looked at how to bridge between what's being collected and what the work in fishing convention is pushing for. And of course, that's a little Fishers Rights Network picture from Thailand, where there's been a lot of advocacy, and Thailand has ratified. Unfortunately, there's only 18 countries that have ratified this convention, but there's a real wealth of guidance in the convention as far as what kind of data should be sought for labor rights issues. And you can see there the main categories being minimum work requirements, conditions of service, accommodation and food, medical care, health protection, and social security. So all of this is really thought through in terms of working with the port state control officers, and that could align with the next slide, which is a little bit about the port state measures agreement. And I pulled this from the FAO website, not that I'm that good with graphics. The port state measures agreement is really looking at the safety of the vessel, but of course, a lot of that has to do with the safety of the fishers. So in the next slide, we created a table where we looked at social standard key data elements. And we thought through, okay, these are the ones where you can see other groups are collecting from that middle column where we signal which other groups are collecting this information. And these are the ones that are somewhat useful for looking at fishers' rights, and it's already being collected. But the question is how is it being analyzed and who's using this data, which gets to all the points Rainer was just making. So fishers' time at sea, that is probably the most essential, and that you can get from the crew manifest, but it's not clear who's analyzing the crew manifest and how well they're analyzing the crew manifest. You saw pictures earlier of a lot of fishers sitting in life jackets. That's the port in, port out center in Songkhla in Thailand, where Thailand has greatly improved its tracking of these things, but they have had cases where the crew manifests show crew members going out, ships coming in, crew manifests coming in, fishers missing, and it wasn't caught. and nothing was acted upon. So crew manifests are good to a point if they're acted upon. The other one is vessel owner record. Lots of groups are collecting information on vessel registration. Question is can we then eventually build out to look at the vessel owner's reputation? But that's not happening yet, but still you have that data point that could be leveraged later. The flags flown, of course, the International Transport Federation, the Global Union Federation in this sector has a Flags of Convenience project, and they're tracking that quite closely. So the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability could be speaking more directly with the International Transport Federation about the flags flown and what they're finding vis-a-vis the flags flown. So the vessel registration and flags flown is another point of connection we see. The other one, of course, is transshipment, because that is one of the reasons that fishers are then, well, that vessels are able to leave fishers at sea for years and years on end. If any of you watched the Ghost Fleet film, you'll have seen videos of fishers who were interviewed who had been stranded at sea for more than a decade. And that is really because of transshipment. So really tracking transshipment is critical. Similar to the VMS AIS data, if it's interrupted, that could be a red flag. And then catch quantity, I think we see everybody collecting it, and in most labor rights monitoring, for example, on factories and farms, when you look at production levels, that's an indicator of some stress levels. You could have a vessel owner saying there are only so many hours worked, but you look at the catch documentation, that would maybe contradict that information. That's the kind of thing you would do in factories and farms. It's not as clear to us how that would work on a fishing vessel because of the many different variables. And I think that's something that probably requires a little more discussion with actual fishers to figure out how catch quantity could be a useful data point, but it is already something where data is being collected. So next slide, Rainer. Okay, so we did a thought experiment where we lined up we tried to think through each of these key data elements in terms of the relevance for fishers' rights there on the left, and the reliability of the data, or how easily people can defraud the data. And that's on the bottom there. And you'll see that at this current point in time, there's not a lot of data being collected from workers, at least not in a systematic way. We understand there are some efforts to bring in data directly from workers, but that wasn't really something that's being collected by the groups that we looked at above, that I mentioned in the above table. So really, from government and from vessels, that little green bubble is meant to indicate data coming from vessels. As Rainer was indicating, there's workers, vessels, and ports. Well, I have governments as ports. So basically, if you look at this, and this is the kind of thing we could discuss, and other people may have different opinions on it. For example, as I mentioned, catch quantity seems to us like it could be somewhat relevant if there's some appropriate analysis done. From our research and everyone we've talked to, it's not very reliable, because there's a possibility of a lot of cheating. Now, there's massive cheating where there are vessels that don't report at all. And then there's everybody cheats a little bit, just like everybody speeds a little bit kind of cheating, which actually does impact fish stock. So the catch quantity verification seems like a challenge. As I mentioned earlier, the time at sea, which is information you could glean from the crew manifests, is probably the most relevant point of data here currently being collected. Its reliability is a little questionable, but you see the arrow there. Basically, if it's shared, if it's part of a collaborative process, as the ECDT principles are putting forward for setting up this kind of a system, then potentially those crew manifests could become very valuable for looking out for fishers' rights. And then you can see some of the other data points. It seems like the government generated VMS AIS data on interrupted signals could be fairly reliable, although I'm sure there are certain governments that might be corrupt and in league with their vessel leaders. And so that, I may be overstating its reliability, but how relevant it is for workers, it's also still a question, but it could be useful as far as a red flag. And so much of this for workers' rights, it's about ECDT could potentially be turning in data that then signals the need for deeper inspections. And that's really the big win here, is if there can be more targeted inspections, those inspections could happen in real time, because right now the random inspection of vessels is could use this kind of potential, this guidance to be used more strategically. Transshipment, I already mentioned. So just looking at the things that are collected by governments, those points in yellow, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability had data collected. They're tracking which countries are Port State Measure Agreement signatories or have ratified ILO C-188 is another point that could be collected, or C-186 was ratified. These are just other ILO conventions that could be additive. But again, how relevant? I mean, it's very, very reliable. It's a public record whether or not the country has ratified it, but it's not necessarily relevant because there's so much more that you would need to find out. If those things have been ratified and if they're being implemented, then you probably have other points of data that are coming in from the vessel or from the government that could be used, but they're not currently tracked in any of the systems we looked at. And then fishery protection system would be another one. I can't be clear. Again, it's a bit like depends on the government, how much you trust it and how much the fishery protection system is reliable. So if we go to the next slide, this is sort of our wish list of where we would love to see things go in the future. When we spoke to human rights and trade union representatives, we asked them not just, okay, how can the stuff that's being collected by ECDT currently be useful, but we also asked them, what would you love to see also collected? And these were some of those elements. So obviously, looking at wages paid from the ship's log would be quite valuable. But they also noted that you need to balance that with wages received, which is the blue one, from workers. So there have been cases where the captain actually transfers the money, but then gouges the worker for the money to get it back. So it looks like the worker's making the money, the wages they're meant to make, the fisher's making the money they're meant to make. But in the end, the fisher's actually repaying the captain because of their manning agency fee or whatever they're getting tapped for. But it's not always clear that wages paid as recorded on the ship's log are really true. So you would have to balance that. Although I note that the red circles around the blue, the red rim around the blue circles are to signal that these are points that will be risky for workers to report on. And the thicker red line means greater risk. So for example, harassment. Obviously, it would be really important to find out from fishers if they were harassed during their time at sea. And that needs to be handled very, very carefully because that could put them at tremendous risk. The manning agency fee, there was quite a lot of discussion as to how to address manning agencies. And we know a lot of companies are now saying that they should pay upfront for the manning agency fee. That doesn't ensure you that fishers are not in some kind of debt bondage, because it's possible that just because you paid the fee doesn't mean the fisher isn't in debt at some other level along the chain of migrating to the job. So really finding that information from the fisher, it's important, but it also is risky for the fisher how it's done. I'm just going to go through a couple more of these, but you get the idea that this when setting up an ECDT system, both for the current data that's being collected and for any thoughts on developing future key data elements. And what I have here are not really key data elements as much as just thoughts towards key data elements as to how they would all need to be constructed. These need to be considered in terms of reliability and relevance. And I'll just grab a couple more here. Where with the Port State Measures Agreement, for example, there's going to be information on the vessel registration with regards to the number of berths per fisher, if you compare it to the crew manifest, for example. In the slide that Rainer left off on, there's the buyer certifier monitoring report that Rainer mentioned. In our experience, most private sector certifications, even those run by nonprofit organizations, don't share their audit reports or their data with government entities. And this has been a big problem in the manufacturing sector, where labor inspectors in Honduras couldn't even get into factories. Meanwhile, private sector corporate social responsibility groups were gathering data from those factories that was not shared with the labor ministry. So really unlocking the collaboration is a key part here as to how this data gets shared and used. And that's a two-way street. There's government data on AIS, VMS interruptions that's not getting shared with other players, other actors like the voluntary certification programs that could be really useful to everybody. One of the key things that you could be collecting from the governments is looking at what ports have grievance support at the port. You could be asking the vessel, what ports do you go to where there's a union or some kind of other NGO support at port? You could ask the vessels that information. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the fishers are able to contact them. That would be information you could potentially get from the civil society groups that we're hoping to see collaborate on ECDT in some ideal setup of the governance of these programs. So I want to move on in the interest of time. I just have the next couple slides should be fairly quick. So thinking through the enforcement and implementation, I think we've said a few things about this, but really, I've already said connecting the risk indicators to more effective inspections, enabling unions and fisher organizations access to the data is really critical. And there, when Rainer talks about empowerment within human rights and participation, this is a real sticking point. And if any of you have read the MSI Integrity's seminal report that was released last summer, it was 10 years of research on multi-stakeholder initiatives. And they really go into depth in some parts about the challenge of having meaningful stakeholder engagement. And this is why we wanted to include this concept that human rights has to do with the power balance, and stakeholder engagement that doesn't acknowledge and address the power imbalance is really not useful. It's not meaningful stakeholder engagement. I mean, maybe I'm overstating that. Maybe the unions will say, yes, please at least engage us on some level. But for the most part, the unions we talk to, they're saying ECDT could be additive, but for us, it's really about getting to social dialogue in the countries, and it's about getting laws passed, Convention 188 ratified, things like that, that will really have staying power for addressing that power imbalance. Again, just reiterating, connecting fishers at risk to support services. That's one of the things that, if you're going to go into a country and set up ECDT and you're going to say to them, of course, this is a comprehensive approach. It's mainly about the catch documentation, but it's also about really figuring out the vessel's responsibility. We need you to tell us, what kind of support services are available for fishers, because you're not going to be able to protect them otherwise. And then let's go to the next slide. We already talked a lot about interagency cooperation. So this slide is just a bunch of pullouts from the key points that the people we interviewed mentioned in the setup of ECDT systems, really needing to look at political will, market incentives, how to build trust, the social support systems, really getting into the assessing recruitment dynamics. Again, not something ECDT is currently doing, but hopefully in some future date and time. And, a couple other points that we've already made in terms of data to drive action. The last two here, though, are really confidential grievance systems and public reporting. That, I think, is down the road, and it's certainly something other human rights and labor rights groups are working on. And ideally, the setup of an ECDT system would engage those groups and then would be somehow connected to these other efforts. Next slide. Just a couple words about the risks of implementation. Really, the problem with reprisals against fishers, and this is something that we're finding a little problematic. For example, in the US, we have the Tariff Act, which allows Customs and Border Protection to hold up goods at port because they have reason to believe it's made with forced labor. That system does not yet adequately protect victims or even witnesses. And so that's a challenge that a lot of people are trying to work on and figure out how to address. And I think as ECDT tries to bridge the gap with other people looking at forced labor in the seafood industry and other labor rights violations in the seafood industry, really figuring out what is the pathway to victim protection is going to be critical. The other piece here, as far as risks of implementation, is misused or unused data. In the 30 years of factory inspections that have been going on, voluntary compliance programs and the like, a lot of people talk about audit fatigue. And I think ECDT systems need to have that in mind. I'm sure you have something similar like that in the seafood industry as well, but it's basically, if you collect data and the data doesn't lead to any change, people really don't want to collaborate in the future. It creates distrust in the whole system, or if it's misused, if it's falsified. So next slide. These are my last two slides, just another kind of some words of warning on the limitations. It's additive, it's a contributor, it's not a solution. The data collected without consequences undermines trust, and ECDT will be implemented in the cases of relatively highest standards. So it's really, how do we use or leverage ECDT in the places where there's greatest risk? That's a question that remains. The last slide, just to end on the positive contributions of ECDT, is really, showing patterns of illegal behavior is going to help everybody. It could be a moment to encourage cross-sector transnational cooperation, which I know is something that a lot of folks are finding useful. I know that Freedom Fund and Humanity United have been funding the CSO network in Thailand, and I recently spoke to one of the organizers of migrant workers in Thailand, and she said, oh yeah, ever since the CSO networks had us sitting down with environmentalists, I don't eat shrimp anymore, which is a completely new thing for this woman who had been organizing workers in shrimp peeling sheds forever. So, I hope we're just at the beginning of this collaboration. The, the huge potential for targeting regulatory resources, I think, could be a way to sell this to governments and industry, because it could save everybody money and make their due diligence more effective. And finally, I think a well-managed system could really increase market trust and market access. We've seen that throughout industries, that when a factory or a farm or somebody who owns a fleet is operating in a legitimate fashion, they're going to gain trust. I think Thai Union has managed to gain a fair amount of trust recently through its collaboration with the trade unions and migrant worker groups recently. So that just brings me to the last slide and two questions, because the last slide is really just contact information. As Jenny said in the beginning, Rainer and I are independently working on this research. I've been working on the seafood industry since about 2012, and I was really excited to get to be part of this project for two reasons, mainly because it's been an itch I needed to scratch for a long time to look at the data, and also to be able to have Rainer kind of come in, not from my activist perspective, but from a more sort of bigger picture, like why we need to make sure human rights gets taken up in a way that's sort of down to the fundamentals, not just at the surface level, which is, and I think I just really need to give a lot of kudos to the SALT team. And we're both, we want to say thank you to the SALT team for the approach that you're taking here and for trying really hard to take this in from that fundamentals kind of level. And the email for the SALT team is there on that slide. Thank you very much.